As you might know, my name's Kevin, and in general, I think CSS is really awesome. It's sort of what I do, what I'm passionate about. And today, what I'm here to talk to you about, as you know, since you registered for this, is to stop over-engineering your CSS, because it's a problem that I see quite often. Just really fast, I pushed this live. Hopefully, I actually pushed it, but you should be able to get all of these slides. This is just a website, so you can get the slides because there's links and other stuff in it, and there's some resources linked at the end. So just kevinpowell.co /over-engineering CSS. Actually, I could double check if the link actually worked or not. Yeah, it does. Okay, good. So you should get them. Hopefully it's the right slides. I remembered to put it live like 2 seconds before I joined, so I'm hoping I pushed the right slides up. If not, I'll fix it after the talk though. So yeah, I want to talk about this idea of over-engineering CSS. So the main plan is we'll talk about what I even mean by over-engineering CSS, why it happens, what are the reasons that people fall into the trap of doing that, and why it's a problem. Because sometimes it's not necessarily always a big issue, or sometimes it can seem really innocent, but there are side effects that can come from doing it. And then also, actually, let's look at some actual examples of how we can avoid doing it. And there's two different main ways that I want to do that. So one of them is to talk about just working with the browser as much as possible. And then also how we can use a lot of more modern CSS. And I'm not going to there's really, with the way CSS is going now, there's some really awesome solutions that we have that were never possible before. I don't want to look at anything that's overly complicated, but how we can create more, at least explore the idea of creating more robust solutions. But I think before we get into it, it's really important to address what I even mean by over-engineering CSS, because it's probably not what you might think. And to illustrate that, I want to show two different bits of CSS. So this is the first one. Some of you, if you're really into CSS, you might recognize where this is even from. But if I were to put this on my YouTube channel right now, I would get lots of people complaining about this code, saying that it's hard to read and that they wouldn't use the word over-engineered, but that would sort of be the consensus or the sort of what they're trying to say about it, and saying that this isn't a good solution because there's easier ways of doing it. Whereas I would argue this is actually a really good solution and not something that's over-engineered. And I would say this is actually something that is, and it's not, you might think it's because it's Tailwind that I'm saying that. It has nothing to do with it being Tailwind. I just grabbed this from a code example because I see lots of code over on my Discord community. And this was an example that came up of somebody who ran into a problem, and it looks really innocent. We have call span full. If you're not used to Tailwind, is just saying this is a grid item. So it's just saying go from line 1 to line -1. And then we're also making it a display flex, align items center, and a gap of 2. So there's nothing on here that is weird. Everything anybody would understand, very straightforward, not confusing at all. But despite that, I say this is over-engineered, and this is actually a really elegant solution that works really well. So we'll get into sort of why I think that. And we're going to come back to both of these examples and actually see them in action and see why this is, because this wouldn't necessarily always be. It depends what we're trying to do, of course. And we'll turn to Wikipedia to start with to get a definition of what over-engineering actually is. I know Wikipedia is not always the best, but I think they did a nice job here of defining it. So they say it's the act of designing a product or providing a solution to a problem in an elaborate or complicated manner where a simple solution can be demonstrated to exist with the same efficiency and effectiveness as that of the original design. And the bold text here, I'm putting the emphasis on that, because a lot of people see over-engineering as a complicated manner, and they stop there. I don't think the complexity of a solution defines whether it's over-engineering or not. I think is there a simpler solution that can be demonstrated with the same efficiency and effectiveness? And I think the simple solution is sort of the big part that I'd like to focus on there. And of course, there's other parts to that as well. And even the idea of what a simple solution is, I'm hoping by the end of this talk, I've actually changed your perception of maybe what a simple solution with CSS actually is, at least to a certain degree. Because then we can all be on the same page on what over-engineering actually is as well. So yeah, the purpose of over engineering or preventing over engineering, we're not trying to avoid complexity. Complexity can sometimes just be the nature of the beast. The main thing that we want to do is prevent frustration and prevent issues, because over engineering, if we have a complex solution that could be simpler, usually it means there's things that it's causing that are making life harder. Maybe the code's really hard to understand, but it often means that making changes to it is also more difficult, that there's pieces that are in there that don't have to be in there, and it just makes the code less maintainable. It makes life a lot harder for those who are using the code and all of that. So we want to avoid frustration at the end of the day, and come up with good solutions. And as I alluded to a little bit earlier, the idea of simple solutions can mean different things to different people. So I really want to sort of convince you of what a simple solution actually is and maybe change your perception of that. Before we get to that, though, I do want to talk a little bit about how it happens and why it happens, because there's different reasons that people over-engineer. Some of them are much more innocent, and some of them are because people are just taking the wrong approach to writing CSS. And that's a lot of what I want to address as we go through this and talk about. And the main reasons I see, and I'm sure there's more than just these four, and there's definitely overlap between these, and we're going to sort of see that as I go through here. But the ones I see are ignorance, over-declaring, stubbornness, and just being too clever. And I've definitely been guilty of a couple of these over time. So it's not, it doesn't matter how good we are at something. It doesn't matter how much experience we have of something. We can fall into any of these at any time. And there's definitely ways to help us avoid them. The first one is the most innocent one, which is ignorance. It sounds rough if you're saying someone's ignorant to something, but to me, it just means you don't know better. And that's not a problem. If you're early on in your journey and you're learning, you see people that are trying so hard to come up with a solution to something and they're struggling so much just because they haven't learned enough yet to know that there's actually a really easy way to do something. And of course, you also see people, like if your job entails writing JavaScript 95% of the time, or if you're a back-end engineer and then, maybe the front-end guy at your office is sick that day and the boss tells you to have to throw a layout together, you're probably going to, you haven't touched CSS in 5 or 10 years. You're using floats to make it work and you hack something together and it sort of does a good enough job. That's not really the fault of the person writing it. It's a bad circumstance. And I also think that, first of all, this isn't unique to CSS. This is any language, and it's probably not even unique to programming. And it's also the easiest one to fix over time, just as long as the person's willing to learn. And often when you're ignorant, or you're using the wrong tools, right? And I got this code from Stack Overflow, which it was somebody asking something wasn't going in the right place. And it's just like, holy moly, what's going on? But it's position absolute is sort of one of those ones that is often what we see when people don't know any better. They find out about position absolute, they start using it to put stuff where they want, and then they move stuff around and the website's not responsive. I also really liked, I don't know how big it is for you guys on the screen, but there's a line height 125 pixels on this, which made me smile because it made it back in the old days of when we had float based layouts and vertical alignment, like centering vertically was really hard. If you had single lines of text, you could center them by using line height because it would break the distance equally on the top and the bottom. I guess it would still work today, but we don't really want to do that. Of course, as soon as the text was more than one line, it breaks everything. But that made me smile because there's lots of solutions in here that we see that people try because they find these weird hacks and doing stuff, and it's just because they don't know any better yet. And hopefully, as they learn more, and by going on to Stack Overflow or wherever else and asking questions, these things start going away. Over declaring, I think, can partially lead or come from this place of ignorance, but this is where I find most of the idea of over engineering solutions comes from. And just sort of first, I think everybody's heard of div soup, where you just divs everywhere. Of course, we used to only have divs basically, and luckily now we have more semantic elements. But even if we're doing some layouts with Flexbox and some other stuff, sometimes we just end up with a ton of divs because it's either we need them or whatever. There's different reasons it happens. And that's in the HTML world, obviously. One thing I've noticed, and I don't remember seeing this as much previously. It's the last couple of years. Maybe it's just the people asking questions. I don't know why. But what I've seen a ton of is flex everythingitis. I don't really have a better name for it, but it's just using Flexbox everywhere and on everything. I've seen it, the star selector display flex, body display flex, change it to, let's do the display flex, change the flex direction so everything's stacking, and then never use any of the flex features. They just display flexed it because that's what I do. And it's display flex everywhere. And Flex is amazing. Display Flex changed how we write CSS for the better. It was a really nice thing to have. And I don't know if it's just part of that where people see that, oh, I'm often using this, so I'm just going to put it in there in case I need it. I'm not really sure. But that actually leads back to this one that I said was, a nice simple solution, or it looks simple, but it's over engineering. And this falls into the case of over declaring, or declaring things that we don't need to declare. And we have, as I said, here's the code that it came from. I don't want to focus on the fact that it doesn't matter it's Tailwind or not, the same mistakes happen no matter how somebody's writing their CSS. And this was just a quick example they were sharing because they were having trouble with something, so they didn't make components or anything like that, which you normally see with Tailwind. But what caught me right away was just seeing they used flex all over the place basically, and if it wasn't flex, they had some grid in there. I think they had 2 grids, and everything else just had a flex on it. And in this case, the flex wasn't actually doing anything because this was a span. All of these were spans, and all of these spans had just a string of text in it. There was no children in there. There was no height set on anything. There was nothing that the flex box was achieving here. So even though we were saying display flex and then item center, the item center wasn't achieving anything because it was just a string of text. There was nothing to center it within. Even I think some of those had backgrounds on them, but there was nothing, even though the background color was on there, there was no height or anything whatsoever in there to actually need the item center because they were already centered because there was nothing, the height was the height of the text itself. And then the gap 2 didn't make any sense because there's just a string of text in there. So the gap's not actually achieving anything. And stuff like this can happen because you change your solution, right? You had something else in there. Maybe it was a div with 2 items and then you changed it. You switched it to a span and you put just the text. But when you're doing that, you sort of have to remember that you had stuff on here that you also need to get rid of at the same time. And in this case, the problem was they had this truncate on here. I think it's the truncate anyway that was doing it, where it was to have an overflow, and then if it was overflowing, the text had an ellipsis on it, and the ellipsis wasn't working, and they couldn't figure out why. There was a few other things we were going over with this code too, but that was one part of it. And it was actually the flex that was causing that issue. And by just doing this instead, we solved the problem. So, that's where declaring something for the sake of declaring it because you're used to always declaring something, it can seem really innocent and it actually gets in the way. And this, I'm saying this for flex because I see people declaring flex on so many things and then having to put in the work to go backwards. So on the body that I mentioned before, you put a display flex on it, then you change the flex direction. Then you also need to change sometimes the justification because you've changed the direction, but then you need everything to be left aligned because you don't want things stretching the full width, which they're doing now, but you could have prevented that in the first place by not declaring display flex. And it's not only with flex that I see this. This is another one that I see all the time now. Once again, these are all from my Discord where people are asking for help. And I know it's a bit small, but all of the arrows are pointing at width 100 VW. And my favorite ones are on the ones where it's on the body. So body, or this is on content. This one's on the body, width 100 VW, body, width 100 VW, body, width 100 VW. And in this case, especially on the bottom one, it's width 100 VW followed by an overflow X of hidden, because as soon as you do width 100 VW, you can get horizontal scrolling if you're on Windows with Chrome where there's no floating scroll bar. So then you have to do an overflow. But if you hadn't done any of that, you would have had it in the first place, right? So we're declaring things that we don't need because that's already sort of what's happening in a way. And it's not always, I see 100% too. The amount of times I've seen body with 100% on it astounds me. And it just, that one probably won't cause any issues, but I'm just like, we don't actually need to declare that on there. And as far as I can tell, the reason this happens with the display flex, the widths, there's I could come up with 100 different examples of this type of thing. It happens because people like declaring stuff. And I think the reason people like declaring stuff is because we feel like we have full control on what we're building, right? We're starting from zero. We have this white page in front of us, and we're the architect of creating this layout that we're going to be building, not realizing that there's already a foundation that's in place. And that foundation is such an integral part of it. And by foundation, it's here, the user agent styles. They exist, and there's something we need to work with. So you get a Figma file and you see something is full width. So you go, oh, it's the full width of my artboard. So I'm going to put a width 100 VW on there. Or you have your static Figma file and you have your component you're building and there's a width and a height in the Figma file. If you look at the CSS panel, it shows you width and height. So let's copy that over. And again, this, as I said, there's some overlap with this idea of ignorance as well, where we don't know any better sometimes. Every element has a specific font in this design file. So let me put a font family everywhere, right? I'm sure people, I don't know if you've seen it. I've seen it. I've done consulting work where I've seen it's the same font family across it's one font family used on the entire website. And basically every declaration I saw that related to like a text element had the font family declared on it, and just font family open sans or whatever. And it just sort of blew my mind a little bit, because it wasn't some junior dev hacking away at like a front-end mentor project. This was a pretty big project that was going with multiple people working on it, and it's just like, oh, I wasn't expecting to see that. And another example that we saw earlier, Flexbox makes centering easy, so I'll put it everywhere, and then if I need it, it's there. And it sounds like it's a good idea, but there's unintended consequences to it. And this is why I feel like all of those are over-engineering, because there's a simpler solution that can be demonstrated to have the same efficiency and effectiveness than the original, and it's just by not declaring them at all. And if we remove the declarations we don't need, we're no longer over-engineering some solutions. And sometimes we don't even realize, and again, this is why I said there's overlap between a lot of these, but we don't realize some of the effects or some of the reasons that are consequences that things can have. So one that I like to show is comparing with auto to with 100%. And the reason I like to show this is just because with auto is the default behavior. If I don't declare anything, we could just turn this off. I don't even need to have it declared on here. Make this a bit bigger for you guys. It's still working up here. It's still taking up that entire width. Again, let's put a background on here so we can just really hammer home that it's taking up that full size. Oh, I probably haven't, let's put an important, I probably have that somewhere lower down. There we go. So we can see it's taking up the full size there. And so is the width 100%. So right away, it's sort of over-engineering because I didn't need this. If I turn that off, I'm not changing the behavior of it. It was already acting like that. But where things are different then is if for whatever reason, and we don't do this like we used to, margins aren't the same thing they used to be. But if I put a margin left, let's turn off that pink background now because it's ugly. But if I put a margin left suddenly on both of those, the width auto still works. It doesn't overflow the container that it was inside of, but the width 100% does. Because I said the width is 100%, which means match the size of the parent, and I'm adding a margin on the left of that. And that's the same thing, like I have box sizing border box on here. Margins are always added to the outside. So it's causing a problem that we'd ideally, or we wouldn't run into if we were just using with auto. And we could even, duplicate this, put it on the right side as well. We can do whatever we want if we have a width auto, whereas the width 100%, we're just breaking it more and more. Now we have, we don't really get a margin on the right side, but once it's overflowing, but the width auto, the default behavior works fantastically well. I don't need to declare something on that because it just does what I need it to do. And it works with basically anything I throw at it. Whereas if I try and, it takes up 100%, so I'm going to put it on there. If we don't need it, don't declare it. And part of the reason I think this also happens, and I see this a lot with the width 100%, I'm pretty sure one of the reasons this does happen is because if we're working on something, we just have black text on a white background, or you might have different colors, but we don't see the boxes normally in CSS unless we add background colors to stuff. So especially if you're early on and your journey and you're sort of trying to wrap your mind around the way CSS works and the way the pages are rendered, put background colors on stuff when you're building your layouts. So you can actually see the size of different things. And then you like right away, you see what's actually happening. So your short bit of text, you actually see that it's taking up all the space, or put borders on stuff and play around with stuff like that to visualize what's happening. Because if you can't see the size of the box, it can be really, oh yeah, I need this to be full size. I have this little bit of text with 100% because I need it to take up all the room. It's a really easy assumption to make, even though I don't need to actually do that. There are, we'll come back around to this idea as well, and ways that we can sort of overcome this idea. The other one, though, that I do want to talk about before we get to the sort of the solutions to all of this is stubbornness. And that's when you get stuck on a solution and you just have to make it work. And I've definitely been there. The solution, the example I want to show here, though, is it's usually when you get really close to getting something to work, and you're like, because you're so close to that working, you feel like just a couple of extra lines of code are going to get you to the rest of the way there. So you keep hammering at it, and then you spent so much time working on it, you don't want to, delete everything. You're just going to be like, whatever, that works, I'm happy with it. So for this, I always like looking at Flexbox and Grid. There's other examples of this. It's not unique to these two things. But I always see people that want to use one when they should be using the other. And it's not unique to one or the other. It goes both ways. So as one example, like these are just some items that have a display flex on the parent, and it's responsive-ish, but I don't like how it looks. So maybe I come and we'll actually start with the, or no, we can do the grow first. I throw a flex grow on it, and then they grow. So it looks a little bit better. It actually looks a bit more responsive, but I don't like how they're all different sizes. So because I don't like that they're different sizes, I throw a flex basis on it. And now, okay, that looks better. Oh, but now this doesn't look better because it's stretching the entire thing, and that looks really ugly. So how can I fix that? So maybe I put a max width on it now. And maybe, a 250 on here would probably make more sense. And then, oh, look, I sort of got that working, except now I got rid of that responsiveness. But and you start fighting with it. Maybe you put this bigger and you end up with a min width, and you're putting in a lot of work into something, trying to force the first solution that you've tried to work, when we could just, instead of that, use grid. And by having grid on there, and of course, let's turn all of this off so we don't have conflicting styles, I can get exactly the type of layout to work that I was trying to get to work in the first place. And I get the same question the other way around. I get somebody who's made this, like this exact layout with grid, but they're like, oh, I really need this last item to span across the entire bottom. And so I'll say, well, use Flexbox then. That's sort of, this is how grid works, and that's what Flexbox is for. And they go, well, no, I've set it up with grid. How can I do it? And I'm like, well, you can't. If this was static, I could just say span across, but because it's not static, and then we have two columns, or because then here it goes like this, I can't change the behavior dynamically with grid the way that Flexbox just acts dynamically. And of course, some people get frustrated then going, well, it's stupid that we have two layout tools and other stuff, but I've compared this to lots of different things. These days, I always say it's like having different pairs of pliers. We have, I don't do a lot of handyman stuff, but I still have probably 3 or 4 different types of pliers in my toolbox. You have a needle nose plier, you have the bulky pliers, you have regular pliers, you have the more snipping ones for cutting wires. They're all the same tool, but they're all specific to certain niches within that idea. They can all grab stuff, but they can each do something a lot better than the others. For layouts, luckily, we basically only have 2 tools. So each one is better at what it does, and we just sort of have to lean into the strengths of the one that we need. So, getting stuck in the solution that you've come up with, sometimes we just have to be willing to delete a lot of stuff and start over fresh, and just don't be scared of doing that. Other times we fall in love with a solution. So I did this, maybe it was 6 months ago, maybe a bit longer. I did a video on the Netflix carousel, but with CSS only, sort of. And while I was creating it, I came up with this idea of using has that I really liked, and it worked really well. And in the end result was great. But one of my selectors looked like this. And it did the job. But it is a bit of a, if you were to come across this in a code base, you'd probably be scratching your head a little bit, and it would take you a little while to understand what it's doing. But I couldn't come up with a simpler way of doing it. And as long as there's not a simpler way of achieving something, I think a complex selector is fine, as we'll talk about a little bit later. But in this case, somebody in the comments commented and said, wouldn't this selector work exactly the same way? It didn't mean that I'd have to actually change my approach slightly because this is using a pseudo element, whereas this one wasn't. And this, like here, I was trying to select the parent of everything to change. Anyway, it got kind of complex and it worked really well. Again, I'm happy with what I did and it was a fun experiment. But then I played around with what he'd recommended or they'd recommended and it did work. And people could understand this a lot easier. It's also using target, so and nth child, but it's, we don't have this list of descendant selectors and these really weird situations. And with has on top of that, it just added to the complexity. And that was definitely me falling in love with the solution, going, oh, this is really cool that I have has and I can do this, and not pausing to think, should I actually be using it or not? And I've been trying to come up with examples for subgrid lately for doing some tutorials, and I keep running into that where I come up with this cool example and then I'm like, oh, I don't really need subgrid for that. I'm not going to, and I don't want to teach people to use subgrid for something that you could do without it, because you're just raising the complexity for not really any good reason. And for all of these, it leads us to this idea of changing our mindset. And I think this is really important for us to be able to do when you're writing CSS specifically. And I think we need, I don't know if I think Christian at the beginning mentioned my podcast. I don't remember, I think it was last week's episode, was on this idea of the CSS mindset. And it's something I've been thinking a lot about lately. Because CSS is very different from other languages. And I'm going to talk, I have a link coming up soon for what started me and sort of made me realize really well. But the other thing that I've realized recently, and one of the reasons it's so different, and I'm sure other people have talked about this and I'm just late to the party on it, but like in, say, JavaScript or other computer programming languages that we have, so if you're coming from anything else, basically, we have lots of predefined tools, right? We have built-in functions in JavaScript that we can use, but they don't do anything unless we use them. And this is a lot like our properties and our values in CSS. We have them all there at our disposal, but they're just waiting for us to use them. And with JavaScript, you start with a blank file, and unless you do something, the JavaScript doesn't do anything. There's zero happening on that front. With CSS, that's not true. With CSS, if we don't declare anything, there's already hundreds of declarations that are already happening in the browser. And this is why that idea of over declaring things and why we don't have to do that, because there's already a ton of stuff that's going on. And I just grabbed like a random part here from my dev tools of a lot of the things. And you see things in here that you would never touch, but like my opacity is 1. That makes sense because we want to be able to see it. The outline color is already defined, and that's kind of interesting. And it's a sort of like a border color. If you don't declare a border color, it matches your text color. Well, that's kind of cool, right? There's all these things that are going on. There's font sizes that are already there. There's text colors. There's colors on our links that's sort of the one. There's the obvious ones that we think about like that, because my link is a different color and it has an underline on it. But we don't think about all of these other things, like what's the default width? My object position 50%, 50%, and that's different. Object position is a lot like your background position if you're using object fit on an image. And interestingly, object position is different from the default background position, and that's why one's top left and one's in the center. And so like there's these defaults that are on there that we often don't have to touch, and that means we can write a lot less CSS because there's all of this stuff that's already been done for us. And a lot of these defaults are really good. And so one thing I've talked a lot about, and I've done like a whole talk on this idea of simplifying our CSS just by relying more on what the browser provides for us. Because if you delete all of your CSS, you have a website that works, right? This is the kitchen sink by Chris Coyer, who, if you just write HTML kitchen sink in Google, you'll find it. I don't think I linked it in my presentation or in the resources at the end. But like, if we have oh no, is it going to work? Browser default, there we go. I don't have anything declared on here, and I have a responsive website. I don't have to write any CSS. And it's when we start declaring lots of things, and if there's problems with responsiveness or there's problems with overflows, it's us who are creating those problems by declaring things that don't work with how the browser is actually working or how it's trying to render things. And like on the block quote down here, you can see there's already a bit of space on it. And if I tried giving this a width 100%, it would actually cause overflow like we saw before, because all the spaces on a block quote are from margins. So this is why I think it's padding on the lists here. So maybe that wouldn't cause an issue, but there's a lot of default styles, and realizing there's default styles there and like being aware of it is so important. And I think it's something that a lot of people don't think of, especially because they're coming from other languages, or it's also kind of weird, right? Like if that there's default stuff on there, and we don't think about sort of the consequences of what that means. And it often means we can write a lot less CSS and we don't have to stress about things as much as maybe we think we have to. The other thing is embracing how CSS works, embracing the globalness of it and embracing the cascade and how the cascade works is so important. I alluded to this a little bit when I talked about that project I saw where every single component had a font family declared on it. And part of that was because they were using CSS and JS, and everything was just like, you get your design on your sprint, you have your local thing that you're working on, and you're starting from scratch. Build it out, there you go. But that's a waste of time, and you're over engineering because you could just have a single global file that at least sets the basics. And the idea of scope CSS is exploded these days. It's really popular. And I don't necessarily think it's a bad idea. It's even coming to native CSS. I just think relying 100% on it is a bad idea. And it results in over-engineering because it results in us declaring things that we don't have to declare. And it's not creating simple solutions, because if you declare your font family everywhere, you can do, there's ways of doing find replaces across an entire code base if you wanted to change your font family. But it also sounds like a little bit of a nightmare at the same time and just ripe for problems, where if you just had a global CSS file that declared your font family, then you solve that problem. And of course, you can overwrite it where you need to because of the way inheritance works, and just embracing how CSS actually does work. In this example that as the screenshot of here, this is from an Astro project that I'm working on, and Astro has the simple, so it's not CSS and JS so much, it's just the style tag. You see this with Vue and Svelte, and I don't know if it's anywhere else yet, but this is like the ease of use of doing this is so nice. But that also opens up this idea of like you could build in really bad habits by using it because it's so easy to do. Where it's like, this is my navigation links, and I could just style everything with my navigation links here. And I know that those styles aren't going to bleed out to anywhere on the page. These affect only these links, nothing else. And the ease of doing that is so nice. And also having the styles with a component is handy, because then you don't have to start hunting things down. You know your styles for that element are there. But like, say you had colors, and that's why I have a variable here that's for my colors that's part of a global file, or this is my background color. And I have different things that I still try to keep global as much as possible. And I have global styles still. I have my root with variables. I have my body styles. I have other things on there to try and take advantage of the global nature of CSS, because that's a good thing as much as people try and fight against it. And then you use these tools that we have to try and just like, I can add some very, anything that's unique to this, I could put on it. And then I think that's completely fine. But just be careful with it. And, don't try and make CSS behave like the other languages that you're used to. There's a reason it's different. And if you've never seen this video, please give it a watch as soon as I'm done talking. Or if you want to leave and go and watch this one instead of watching me, that would be cool too. I think it's that good. It's by Miriam Suzanne. It's called CSS is So Weird. Just go on YouTube and search it, or if you go in the slides after, the link is here. And in the video, she talks about why CSS is different from other languages and sort of why it's on purpose that it's different as well. I'm not going to go through the entire thing because she does a better job than I will of explaining it in that video. But the main thing is with CSS, there's the part I talked about before where we already have code that's been written for us, right? So we already have all those user agent style sheets that are doing stuff. And a lot of those behaviors are good. And then what she goes more into, but that is like the system a little bit there. But what she goes into is also why, we don't know how the user's interacting with our page. And CSS has a lot more unknowns than any other thing you'd ever write. You don't know the system settings they have. So are they changing their colors through like a forced color mode? Have they set a different font size at their system level? Have they set a different zoom level on their browser? What input device are they using? Are they using a mouse, a keyboard? Are they using a touch screen? Can they see the website, or are they using a screen reader? What's the color gamut of their device? There's a million and one different things that the user actually has control over that we don't have control over, and that's very different, and makes it so something like CSS actually has to work really differently, and we have to approach CSS differently than other things. And I'd really strongly recommend giving that a watch if you've never seen it before. And then, yeah, the last thing that we can do, and I alluded to this one a little bit too, or the last problem that we can run into is being too clever. And as I said, I sort of did that with that example that I was sharing earlier with the has selector. But I want to use this section to talk a little bit about CSS-only solutions. Because sometimes I'm talking about simplifying our CSS, and sometimes we can simplify our CSS by using JavaScript. I think sometimes we can also simplify our JavaScript by using CSS for stuff. I've done a video, I know Amit Sheen's talked about it, and there's other talks out there on simple CSS solutions for JavaScript problems and that type of idea. And 100%, there's lots of, especially pseudo classes that people aren't aware of, that they end up coming up with complex JavaScript solutions for. But CSS-only solutions can be problematic as well. It can definitely be over-engineered. And you see lots of posts like this if you look up CSS-only stuff. So like 4 ways to create awesome CSS-only accordions, 25 beautiful CSS carousels, 20 cool HTML and CSS tabs, and other stuff like this. And I do think that all of these can have a lot of value. The value that comes from CSS-only solutions, and sometimes they're fantastic. Sometimes you have very good solutions that just they work really well. Everything they need to do is there, and that's fine. The problem I see with most of these solutions is they don't take into account everything that we need to take into account when we're doing something for production. But when we're creating these, you can learn so much. So I'm never going to tell somebody not to try making a CSS-only solution. Because the amount that I've learned over time by creating stuff with CSS only, with these really crazy 100% definitely over-engineered solutions, is insane. You learn new stuff. You make new connections on how CSS is working. You come up with weird hacks. It's fun, and you can learn a ton by doing it. But that doesn't mean they're good solutions, because they can present all sorts of different problems. And one problem that I like to look at, and this is actually, the video for this actually came out today. On my YouTube channel, on infinite horizontal scrolling. So it's often you see like logos that scroll all the way across the page. And when I had the idea for this video, I was looking to see what other people had created. And most of the solutions that I saw, or I came across some that were with JavaScript, many were really well done, but a lot were saying CSS only, and they would have something that looks like this as the HTML. And that's kind of awkward, because if you look at it, and this is one example, but there was other ones, but the main thing is you have item 1 to 5 and then item 1 to 5 again. And this is sort of something you need for the infinite scroll. You have to have duplicate content. There's no way around that. But the problem with that then, if you're writing the HTML, first of all, that's really annoying, right? You have to actually duplicate your content and remember to do that every time. And then if a screen reader were to come across this, they'd actually see the content twice. And that sucks too, because then they'll read it out 2 times and you get duplicate content being read to you. That's not ideal. So this is where I feel like you can reduce the amount. You might actually have to write more code, but you're coming up with a better solution. And this was the final result that I came up with on mine, where I did a progressively enhanced one, where we get the infinite one. You can control the direction of it just with a data. Let's just go and find it. I have we'll go on the second one, because I think the data direction, I can just switch that and it's going to go in the other direction. Or we'll put that one back to right. And I can also control the speed with slow or fast. But the main thing is here, I don't have duplicate content. I just put the content in once, and it doesn't matter what the content is, it's going to work. I just need a scroller and a scroller inner, which all of these require anyway. And then I put my content that I need in there. And then I use some JavaScript to do 2 things. First of all, let's just take off the JavaScript. So if somebody opts out of motion, because especially sideways motion like this, and somebody's scrolling down, if somebody has vestibular issues, that can actually be really problematic for them. It can cause nausea and other, they're going to leave your website basically. So if somebody has system preferences, they're asking for reduced motion, then they get this instead, where all the content is there and it just works, and I'm using flex wrap and there's nothing too fancy going on. then if they have, or if they haven't opted out, or if they haven't asked for reduced motion, then they get the movement. And I'm going to take that off screen because I find it annoying too. But the main thing is I'm actually duplicating the content then using JavaScript. And by duplicating it using JavaScript, I can also easily add an area hidden on there to make sure that I'm hiding the extra content from screen readers. And the advantage with this is it's actually more code. I had to write more JavaScript, and then I'm now relying on JavaScript instead of a CSS-only solution. It took me longer to write this to be able to do it, to have that. But to me, this is where I want to talk about simpler solutions. In a sense, to me, the simpler solution isn't which one is simpler to create, which one doesn't have simpler code, but when I go to use that code, which one is the simplest one to actually use. So if I come on this and I need to create a new one, I don't have to remember, I don't have to document that I have to duplicate my code and that all the duplicated code has to have an area hidden on it. And if I forget to do that, I don't know, is there a way to test for that? Then I'd have to maybe write tests. It sounds like a nightmare. I want to create something that maybe takes longer to create, has a little bit more going on with it, but then when it works, I can just pick it up and use it, and it's just going to work. And in this case, I'm using a little bit of JavaScript to make that possible, but we can do that with CSS only as well. It's just to really hammer home that more complex solutions can be better solutions. And that brings us back to this that I looked at earlier on. If you haven't seen this before, this is from Every Layout by Andy Bell and Hayden Pickering. If you're very heavy into CSS and you write lots of CSS, I would recommend you check it out. There's a few free examples, and it is a paid product if you want to unlock all of them. But I learned a lot just by seeing how they did stuff, and there's some really good layout solutions in there. It's a really good product, so I would definitely check it out. And again, you can just Google Every Layout. And this is one of the solutions that they do have. So here's the exact same thing 2 times. One of them is how you would normally see it. So we have a sidebar and a main. And in this case, I did the same class with sidebar. I used display grid instead of flex because then I could set it up within a media query here. And it works fine. There's no problem with it. And this code is probably a lot easier to read, and people would understand what this is doing right away. Right, so it works. I have a sidebar, it collapses when I'm smaller than this size. Or I could do it with the Every Layout solution, where we have the, actually I had the classes on here that I don't need, but works really similar. So you might say that this is the better solution than this one, because if you come across this code, and again, I should have copied and pasted it from this version with the first child, last child, because I think it's a little bit cleaner. But if I'm using this code and I come across this in a code base, it's a lot harder to understand what's actually going on 100%. So is this a case of being too clever or being invested in your solution or over engineering a solution? The thing that I really like about the second solution, and it leans into this idea of intrinsic design and working with the browser. And the reason for that is my sidebar, my content is actually what's defining when the break is going to happen. In this case, I'm defining it with this random number that I'm choosing here. And that means I'm sort of playing around. It's like, okay, I guess I want it to happen around here. Maybe I want this to be 875. Maybe I want whatever. You're coming up with a number, right? And breakpoints, people always ask me, how do you come up with a breakpoint? And I usually say when the layout breaks. With this solution, what's nice about it is that it's this number that's defining when the break happens. So like this is a little bit of Flexbox hackery for sure. And it's set up in this way just to ensure that this is basically always 20 rem, but when we get small enough, it will always stretch because we have a flex grow 1. The rest of the time, because this flex grow is so big, it's never going to change size. It's going to stay at 20. And the breakpoint is when the content is less than 50% of the viewport. As soon as that's, or whatever the parent is. So as soon as these two are equal in size, it's going to break and go over. This is a lot more intuitive to actually use and to set up. And once it's part of the code base, it probably doesn't get touched or changed later on either. But we'll talk more about this again in a second, because there's ways of making things more readable as well. And as I'm sure some people are saying right now, more verbose and easy code, easier to understand code is better. I hear this all the time on my YouTube channel. I personally think easier to use code is better. So another one that I really like, this is from Stephanie Eccles, small.css. And we're going to start with this example. This is my own. This isn't hers. I should probably take this off because that's not where that comes from. This is a card that actually, here's the cards that Stephanie created. My cards have very simple CSS. So in this card, I have just some, nothing too fancy. If the card image is at the top, it's at the top. If it's at the bottom, I change it a little bit. That's it. This is all the code that I have. And I have this card that works. If the image is on the top, it's there. If it's on the bottom, it's there. And it's fairly easy. But the HTML is a little bit more complex than I'd ideally like it to be. Because let's compare it to Stephanie's example. And just to show you, if I look at the CSS or the HTML on hers, we have an article, and then I have an image in each 3 paragraphs and the link. And what's cool here is I can move the image down, and it's going to move down, and it's fine. Everything works. The layout's still there. I can move it down again. I can place it anywhere in here I want, and it's always going to be full width. It's always going to work. It doesn't matter where the image is in the code. Everything with it just works. And you can move other pieces around too. It's very robust, and it works really well. So I don't have to worry about structure. I just need a card with a class on it, and then I can throw any content in there. This is usually how I traditionally see things, where you get like an article, and then I have like my card image top to say that the card should be at the top. And then I have, actually I fixed it so I didn't need it, but then you'll have like a card image bottom. And then, to get your card that's going to be on the bottom. And then I have my image, and then I have to put my content has to be in sort of, it could be card content, or you might say card body or something like that your content is going inside of, because you need to add the padding around that so it's not touching the edges, because you need the image to be touching the edges. So you need something else that's going to sort of create the padding. So I'm adding complexity to my HTML, but I'm keeping my CSS very simple. Stephanie did the opposite. She has very simple HTML, and her CSS is granted more complicated. There's more going on in here. So she's selecting everything and putting the margin to 0. Then we have the image only that's getting some stuff on it. Then if the image is the first child or the last child, some things are changing. Anything that's not an image is getting changed, but then it depends if it's the first child or not the first child. Then we have more coming down here about if it's the last of type, if it's not an image or an H2 or an H3 or an H4. So there's definitely a lot more that's happening in here. It's more complicated to set up. And if you were to come in here and start going through it, and it's a new code base for you, and you're trying to see what's happening in here, it's definitely more work. And some people will say something like this is an over-engineered solution. But if I go to use this, I need to make a new card. I'm part of this team. I go in, I don't have to, I see the documentation. The documentation says, put an element, give it this class, and then put whatever you want in there, and it's going to work. Whereas if you read the documentation for mine, it says, well, put your element, give it a class, give it a modifier class if your image is on the top, or a different modifier class if your image is on the bottom. You need to have a card image class on the image. You need to have a card content, because that's what's creating the spacing around it. And it's like, yes, if somebody were to come across the CSS of this because they need to make a change to it, it would probably be easier for them to tweak something. But if somebody's actually using this in an active code base, they're going to 100%, I would rather have this where I just put a card and throw stuff in there, and I know that no matter what I do with it, it's going to work. So it's a more complex solution. It took more work. It took more thinking to get it to come together. But that doesn't mean that it's an over-engineered solution, because in my opinion, it's more effective and more efficient. And we usually, hopefully, write our CSS and then have it to use over and over and over again. And in this case, this is exactly what that's doing. So we can use this over and over again. I could use these cards wherever. And every time I reuse it, I'm happy I have this solution. Whereas this one, I'll remember it over time, but it's a little bit more annoying because I have more work to do to write my HTML and to get everything to fall into place. Another example that I asked about on Twitter, and I also did a video on this. So this is my own one where it was creating this layout where you have like full bleed areas, so things that stick out the side. And part of the idea I was talking about this is, do people feel like this is over-engineered? And I could do it with text and an image. I could do it with just text on both sides. I could do just images. You could, it doesn't matter what side things are going on. So this is very similar to the approach that Stephanie took, in that it really depended on the position of things. So I had a full width split screen, and I'm saying, well, if it's not an image, we need this specific padding on it. If it is an image, you can see even here, the grid template columns got a bit more complex. I'm using pseudo elements to fill in extra background on wider screens on the grid that is set up for it, and some other stuff. But a big part of this was I wanted to create something that if I was adding it to a new existing project that already had like a wrapper, because this is just a regular wrapper, I want to be able to match the width that's on there. I wanted something that would be easy to use, but not necessarily to set up. The setup for this is a little bit longer, and it definitely takes more time to go through all of this because I'm trying to think of every solution or every potential situation that could be thrown at it. But then when I want to use it, all I do is I have my section, I put a full width split screen, and then I have an element and another element, and then put whatever content in there I want. It'd be nice if I didn't need these divs here, but we need two sides. So I had to have a container for the content that would be on the right. And then same thing here. I have a content and then just the image here. I could do it with just content. So here's a div on one side, a div on the other side. They could have backgrounds, they don't have backgrounds, whatever, it's always going to work. So it's a more complex solution, but to me, that doesn't mean it's an over-engineered solution. It means that it's actually a simpler and more effective solution to use. And of course, and to me, that's the really big thing. Just before we go to the next part on readability, I think usability to me is the most important part of it, because again, hopefully we're not going in the code and writing it over and over and over again. If we come up with a really good, a very robust solution, we shouldn't be having to go into that CSS and make changes to it. It should be there and it should just work. And then it doesn't matter what happens after that. And if somebody does have to come in and make changes to it, well, that's where we can make things easier to read as well. The first one is using comments, right? So the size of the sidebar when it isn't stacked is 20 rem. So I can just put a comment in there and let people know that's what's happening. And then the minimum size of the main content before wrapping, and it's 50%. So a couple of comments can go a really long way into making something that's hard to understand a lot easier to understand. And I know, some people are very big on commenting and other people go a little fast and they don't bother with it. The other thing, the way I tend to love working is by using custom properties. So I could just put, I have width sidebar width is 20 rem, my minimum main area width is 50%, and then I can have crazy code after that. But if I have some clear custom properties, I can customize this really easily now. If I have to come in and make a change to the sidebar width, I'm not digging through code to try and understand what's happening. I'm seeing at the very top a custom property, I change it and it works. And the nice thing with custom properties too is it means I could use my width sidebar in 4 different places, and each one I just change the custom property value and it changes for each one of them if I needed to. So it does make it a little bit more robust. But I also think that custom properties can really help with readability as well if we use them well. And just really fast, I always get asked, now that I've started doing this with the underscore in the front, I really hope that I'm right, because I've been saying it's Leia Veru who started this, but I might be mixing it up, but I've been saying that a lot lately, so I'm hoping I'm not mixing her up with someone else. But it's sort of this idea of like a private property where I'm saying that, like, if I came across this in the code and I saw the underscore, I know that it's not a global CSS property. It's something that's locally scoped. So if I want to find where that's being used, I wouldn't go back to my root. I would just look for the parent and then I could find it there. So it just makes it a little bit easier to know where your custom properties are coming from. So yeah, the idea, I guess, with all of this, it's not always, I put writing less CSS here. It doesn't mean that everything we're writing less CSS doesn't mean everything we write is shorter or simpler. And it doesn't even mean that we're always writing less CSS. I should put writing less code as the title there, because it means that we're not declaring things that we don't need to declare. And it means that we're creating code that is simpler to use. So when I'm using that code, I can be writing a lot less code. And if I need to make changes to it, it's hopefully a lot easier to do. And I'm creating really robust solutions. And of course, the idea of not declaring things that we don't need to declare. And I think it all comes down to this idea of writing purposeful CSS. So it's really important to realize that everything we have already has a style on it, and to work with the browser instead of against it. Embracing that idea alone is really, really, really important. Before we start trying to get into robust solutions, is just working with the browser and not over declaring things, because that's where you're going to start running into problems. And then embrace the idea of ease of use and customization. Custom properties make things easier to customize, and ease of use, to me at least, is really important. And I'm hoping maybe I didn't win you over 100% with some of the more complicated CSS. But hopefully that idea can sort of sink in a little bit, that like, yeah, I don't mind if my CSS is slightly more complicated if it means it works better and I can do more stuff with it. And for whoever's using those classes, they're not having to come in with more modifiers or more changes or having to go back into the code more times. I've created a really robust, easy to use system that's just going to work. That's it. It's just going to work. That's, I think, the point of writing CSS is so once it's written, we don't have to keep going back and writing more of it. And the less we have to touch it and the more we can just use it, the better. So yeah, here's just, if you do come through the slides after, that's it. So if you come back through the slides after, there's links to a few of the things that I talked about there on this last slide. And if you're looking to find me anywhere, there's YouTube. I've started a podcast now that's, as Kristen said, the last one was sort of CSS specific, but they're more front end, semi-focused, talking about random stuff that I find interesting that week. If you prefer a written version, it's the podcast is the audio version of my newsletter. And of course, if you want to learn more about CSS, I do have some courses.